We are today dealing with the army of holy monks, nuns, ascetics, hermits, indeed prophets and saints of the Old Testament who have found the Lord through the simplicity of emptiness, poverty of spirit, simplicity, silence and separation from all that is not God. So we do well to conclude this holy day in that ambit of being aware of what encounter means. We are before the living God. We forget that. The great danger of the priesthood, especially perhaps in the West, is familiarity with what we're doing. There's an old saying which is very true: familiarity breeds contempt. And alas, we can fall into that more in our time than before because of the reduction in the number of celebrants and therefore the increase in the number of celebrations that we might be asked to execute. And that is, of course, something which we have to be aware of, that we are more in danger than before. Also by the fact that the barrage of protection which was still there massively in the Christian people, which would protect the sacred and the awareness of the otherness of the priest and what he was doing, is not there in the same way. And for instance, to give concrete examples, whereas before people were aware that the sacristy would have been in some way an extension, an antechamber of the altar, because the priest was obliged to be saying prayers before and after, and so on. There was an ethos of sacrality there, which is all more or less gone. So we find what happens, that in the sacristy we are talking before and immediately after. And that is not the best way to approach the holy ground of the altar, where we're actually alone essentially with God at a certain time and have to be so. And again, this element of having to take into consideration massively the relation with the people during the celebration, all of the celebration now, not just the first part, whereas before, the other part, there was a huge cloud of separation. The priest did not exist as a human being, but was alone with his God. That basically is no longer there. So we have to make up for it and be very careful that we are not acting or performing some kind of theatre or entertaining at the altar. That is not what we're doing. We should be invisible and in communion with Him, and bring the people with us, that they may not see us at all, but only Jesus. And therefore, that actually comes through in the way we approach the sacred things, the way that we express our nothingness before God. It comes through. There are many celebrants who, unfortunately, even at the most sacred parts of the sacred mysteries, are, it would seem, relating to people in a very human way. For instance, to be very concrete, they will take the sacred species and, at least before the consecration, the unconsecrated bread, and then they will start while looking at the people and so on. See, this is, again, showing their mentality. Now, the Church is a wise mother. It gives us the gestuality. Obedience to God is simple. Just do what we're told. It's all there. But if we want to be in some way caring and making the people respond, there are ways within the liturgy of exploring that chant and so on, of the consecration. There are ways and means of elevating without disobeying. And again, when it comes to the elevation itself, it is called ostension rather than elevation. But again, if, for instance, one takes with one hand like that and throws in front of one's nose, but people looking at our nose, they don't want to see us at all. They want to see Jesus. So a little bit of separation, and that dignity of giving him a throne, that lazy attitude. The Lord is Lord of all, and there are ways and means in the new rite of showing it with great dignity. This disappearing, that is humility. before our God. The angels don't draw attention to themselves, but they're there all around. They're in the midst of angels at that point. So, this element here of coming into an encounter is something which places us, yes, us, in the mystical plane. We are there alone with our God, with a whole army of angels waiting our word. They're there in posture of expectation and adoration. And this word, which they can't, only we can pronounce, they're waiting for it. And so the calmness with which those sacred words, indeed all sacramental words, are pronounced. The same applies for instance, absolution. Those healing words need to be heard. And the touch of the consecrated, the warm, consoling hand of the priest, that touches the soul at a deep level. People are healed. Many tears come in good confessions. And His healing in the name of the Lord. Indeed, He's healing through us. So never rush anything which deals with our God. There's time for the most sacred. We are blessed in the renewal to have means of, for instance, if we have to go from one celebration to another and we are limited in time, we have means of doing it without rushing. Because whereas before there was only one formula and it was very heavy, very long, leading to a precipitation of the words, now there is no need for that. One can take shorter formulas if one needs to and say them slowly in a posé way, which is reflective. And the new rite, well celebrated, is actually more contemplative because it is in that rhythm of calm, unhurriedness, with pauses, if one wishes, inserted to take in, whereas in the old rite one is obliged to keep moving. Now, in the Gospel of St. John, we have some beautiful words here which touch us as ministers of the Most High. I would just like to pause here. It's chapter 7 of St. John's Gospel, and it is that short passage where the Spirit comes in here. It's verse 37. On the last day, the great day of the festival, Jesus stood and cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me. Let anyone who believes in me come and drink. As Scripture says, from his heart shall flow streams of living water." Whose heart? There is a verse in Matthew which says, "From the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks." Now, abundant is abundare, waves overflowing. And we tend to speak willingly of what interests us. Hence, if we listen to people, we see what their world is. If it's football, it will be football, and so on. And so, we, being bathed in these other things, although we make contact with people on their level initially, and that is the bridge, we don't remain there. But people need to see in us another interest, that our focus is different. That in itself is a quiet evangelization. There's another point of reference. The norm is not all this stuff. So also when it comes to any mandated word, any word of preaching or whatever it might be, there too, this abundance, this overflowing of what is there comes out. It is not difficult to give the word to the people of God if we're in that mode of receiving and fullness. On the other hand, if we're giving in a human way all the time, so much that there's no more coming in, then we're in trouble. People will pick up. He said that before. It's recyclage, recycling. And if we're not careful, one can see that happening. In fact, Pope Francis has spoken about it in Evangelii Gaudium. It talks about this presumption that we might think that we're spiritual because we can actually preach and so on without preparing, but it's actually quite insidious. Because what's happening, we're preaching from our store, our stock. That's going to run out. And people will pick it up. So, ressourcement, that element then of receiving what we're to give, gratuitously. Things come to us when we're with Him. Why? We have the mind of Christ, as St. Paul says. We have the mind of Christ. By osmosis, we pick up His way of thinking, His thought. And if we're there looking at love, essentially, then we feel His pain too. And without any huge amount of time wastage, for instance, in big exploration on internet, which might be distracting to prepare a sermon, we can receive from Him the word that He wants for that group of people whom He knows. So, Lord, what word do you want me to give them? That element of spiritual preparation, nourished by quiet meditative Lectio Divina on the readings on which we preach, is a contemplative mode, when the Spirit Himself is giving us the Word. It's another way of preparation from perfect exegetical notes, which is of value and might help the sermon when we want to explain a word, but it mustn't remain there. And the people need something which touches, something which is concrete. As I say, something which is visual on the mind. They remember the concrete things. A story is the shortest distance between the truth and the human heart. Now, in that same Gospel of St. John, we have that very beautiful passage in chapter 4, when he meets this puzzled Samaritan. And in that there's a whole wealth of teaching on many levels. In chapter 4, we have here at verse 10, if only you knew what God is offering and who it is that is saying to you, give me something to drink, you would have been the one to ask, and He would have given you living water. Again, there's living water coming. But that first word there, which is translated here in daily talk, as we would talk to each other, that's how this translation of the Jerusalem Bible works. But the Greek is actually more dense, and it comes through in Latin as si scires donum Dei. And that has been taken up by Blessed Columba Marmion. We monks were formed with the giants like that, and these are eternally valuable, his works on the priesthood, monastic life, and the life of the soul. And this is brought out as a whole meditation on si scires donum Dei, if we only knew what we had right there. Now, that applies in a maximum way to us. Si scires donum Dei, what we have, what we are doing. The presence. The presence, if we spend time with it, grows rather than diminishes in its power over us. There is no need for familiarity. It's like people falling more deeply in love and discovering new angles of each other and being fascinated and being relaxed with each other. Because true love is to be in silence and happy just to be there. Hence it is that, like St. John, we're happy to be reclining on the breast of the Lord. That is adoration, or anything which leads to encounter on a deep level. We need space. Now, this question then comes through, because this abundare, this abundance, people also will pick up. He's a friend of God. There was a child one time in England who wrote a question to God. God, is Father Coe a real friend of yours, or does he just have a working relationship? Well, that too can be the question that people might secretly ask. Because when people see us loving someone and behaving in a certain way, that's a huge sermon in itself. Now that is concrete too. In the sacristy, there are ways and means of dropping gentle hints to the altar boys, ministranti, all these people who might be there in the sacristy. We can educate them. Quietly going into mode ourselves, once we're vested. We were taught actually in formation in our monastery that once we were fully vested, we were already somewhat in persona Christi, and we should not be doing or talking about other things, even once the chasuble is on. There was already something but otherness there. Now that can be educated there in the sacristy, that once the priest is vested, he goes there, there's usually a crucifix over the vesting place. And one can just remember, I remember I was brought up in a Benedictine parish. My parish was run by Benedictines, and they always did that. You could see them, they would never talk once they had their chasuble on. There were 6 monks there running our parish. It was run by Ampleforth, and there was a dignity in the sacristy, and we weren't supposed to be talking in there. And that rubs off. We pick that one up as children. Now, at the end too, coming back, if we explode once we've got to the sacristy, then in a sense, we're dispersing grace into the atmosphere. In the monastic life, there is a gliding in and a gliding out. It depends on the local monastery how it's done, but the statio, or the equivalent, whatever it might be, is a gliding in. But also in the Rule of St. Benedict, one can see it quite clearly, it actually is quite explicit. The going out too is there, that one goes out without precipitation and indignity, maintaining the silence. And he says that one may allow someone who wishes, one of the brethren, to remain in church if he is so moved by grace. Sit oratorium quod dicitur, let it be what it is called. And so that applies also to any place where the Blessed Sacrament is. All the angels are there, it is a place apart, and we need to defend that. And priests need to bear that responsibility before their God and their people. If they talk, especially loudly, in the sacred presence, they educate their people to do the same. Everything that we has a repercussion on the people around us, for good or for bad. Now, unfortunately, I have noticed in Ireland that bit by bit, this element of talking freely in church is coming in, and it has come in many places. And it is not wanted by Almighty God. Little Jacinta of Fatima, she's the youngest Beata, I believe, in the church. She was dying in Lisbon, far away from her family. And just before she died, it seems that heaven intervened and gave something which, as a last message, wanted to be known. She was observing the people were talking in the chapel of the orphanage where she was dying. And she said this quite clearly: Our Blessed Lady does not want people talking in church. And she asked that that message be given to the superior, Mother Godino. It had no real effect. And so, little Jacinta, child though she was, obviously nudged and pushed by a greater force, said that she wanted this message to be given to the cardinal. Our Lady does not want people talking in church. Now, we as human beings forget, because we're very much engaged with the visual, the immediate people around us. And we're also used to having the instinct of being courteous and polite. Therefore, this mode of courteousness and politeness enters into any encounter that we have. So tendentially, we are also as courteous and polite in church, and therefore we go into a mode of greeting. Now, there's never any need to upset or hurt or offend. But there are ways and means of gently educating. Now, in the monastic life, in a good monastery, the rule would be more or less this, that in the regular places of which the church is one does not engage the vocal cords. If communication is necessary, whispers. Now that's a huge difference. Even gently to start engaging the vocal cords, one forgets and one gets louder and more audible. But the whisper, it gets the message. On two levels, the immediate communication happens without offending, but the education also is given, and people will pick it up. It's no big deal, but it's very effective. Gently educating people to the sacredness. And now and again, one can actually mention certain things concretely in a sermon, not concentrating on the issue as such, but as part of a greater point, bringing in the consequences. And then, as part of a teaching, they will pick up and see the meaning behind the actual consequence. So not starting at the consequence, but then one can therefore also transmit on a spiritual formation level, we ought, therefore, as a people, to honour God like this. And the good people out there are glad to hear certain things. Don't think they're going to get in any way offensive, because actually they know instinctively that certain things are so. People have what we call the sense of the faithful, the sensus fidelium. They know by instinct from the Holy Spirit that yes, certain things are true, but nobody says them. And they are glad to hear certain things said. Now, the Lord goes on, if you knew what you had, in other words, the gift that you had, that then, with regard to what we have, is at its maximum. When we are approaching those central moments of our existence, which are those times when we enter into persona Christi, we are no longer ourselves in a sense, the Lord is fully there in us, using us, then things also happen on the level of contact. Great priests, priestly souls like Don Chotin or Don Gabriel Sorte, great Trappist abbots, they knew that things happened at the moment of consecration. Don Gabriel Sorte, Vicar Abbot General of the Trappists, he was known to have said that he made no exception, je fais aucune exception, he said, tout ce qu'un prêtre demande au moment de la consécration est accordé. All that the priest asks for at the moment of consecration is granted. Now, remember in the old rite in which he was celebrating, the Cistercian rite in his case, but there is an intimacy there because concelebration wasn't there, and therefore he's alone and it's in silence. And it is actually extremely powerful in the old rite, that silent consecration. Alone with the angels, far away from anyone. Now, but it's obviously the same power, but it's there. But the reason obviously is that at that point we are, as it were, for a fraction of a moment, as it were, Christ. And therefore there's a close identification. And our will is His will is ours. We are totally His. So we have a power of His heart. Now, other things too. If we have a problem, and I've heard this from one or two priest friends and read it, if one has a problem on one's mind and one doesn't know what to do, and I find it actually happening quite often, one is celebrating, and actually the problem may not be on our mind at the moment of celebrating, but suddenly, at the moment either of consecration or elevation or Holy Communion at Mass, suddenly a flash comes. Of course. And one sees with, as it were, the mind of Christ what He wants done. Now, therefore cultivate this element of getting into a mode of contact with Him. And these are privileged moments, not to be lost or dispersed. The human at that point does not enter into the equation. Now, also, there are graces at work in those immediate minutes after we have received the sacred species. We are tabernacles of the Most High, and those moments need to be safeguarded. In the renewal, it is actually within the rubrics, the instructions given, that these silent moments be there. Sustained eventually by some chant, but they are there. That's an advantage of the renewal, that there is a padding, a cushion, if it's properly celebrated, of the presence after Holy Communion for all concerned. We do not need to hurry those. They belong to the people of God. And to fill them, as some priests do, with notices and all kinds of human stuff is a desecration. Some priests don't even await the moment for giving parish notices. They're already coming in at that point. It's nonsense. Nonsense. This is the mystical encounter of the people of God. They have a right over that freedom. And by the way, the devil knows it full well. So what does he do? He does all in his power to reduce that moment. And one big way is to multiply, without necessity, the number of extraordinary ministers, because that brings it to an end more quickly. Why wish the most sacred? The charismatics know it full well, and they know how to create an atmosphere of gentle healing with music, and certain things take time. They pray with people, but they create an atmosphere. Well, at Holy Communion we have far more than that. Why should we be more hurried? Greater blessings never come in then. The true ministry of lay people at that point would be to sustain it with a beautiful chant. And then, if that is happening, then that limits the damage to some extent with what might be threatening us immediately afterwards. Because people come to us in the sacristy straight away. It's a difficult thing to avoid, and then it makes it difficult for us to have a moment of thanksgiving. It's more easy on weekdays. But at least if we can somehow, intramissam, within the celebration itself, safeguard the minimum, then at least some consequences follow. Because we have, on a Sunday anyway, a chant of some kind, some song at the end of the celebration usually, so that also, to some extent, pads it and limits the damage of an immediate banality coming in. And we can, of course, stay for a while there with the altar boys, singing at least a good part of that hymn. Some priests go out straight away. Well, that's missing that point again. And people also in Ireland, they start to go out. If you go out, they can't get out quick enough. And that's a bad thing, because there's grace there being lost in the atmosphere. These moments are precious. So we can educate people, explain to them, this is the most important moment. And if we have children, because I don't know what it's like in Holland, but if one is called upon to celebrate on a weekday in a parish in Ireland, usually, once or twice a week, one will have lots of children, because they come from the schools. And therefore, you have before you maybe a whole load of boys there, and a whole load of girls there. And at that age, they will listen. And forevermore, they will take in the message you will give them. On their level, that's very powerful. And you can educate them to the sacred. You know, a child is an angel, uncontaminated, as long as he's still innocent. They're the angels of the earth, les anges de la terre, according to the Curé Mars, and they have to be preserved and protected. And the rapport of a priest with one of these innocent souls is very important. There's a natural affinity with a child, yet in a state of grace. The eyes of a child are pure, and he recognizes that in the priest. He sees this is a man of God, and it's Jesus for him. Now, therefore, all this is what we're working at, and a child is very much aware of the sacred. Don't minimize what a possibility is. They can also, more than you think, stay in adoration. I had little children with me over the weekend, and they were in adoration, and they were happy to be there in my little chapel. A child knows somehow that Jesus is there, and within his own means, he will be happy. There are always means of keeping it going with little bits of chant or whatever. They are happy to be with Jesus. Now, I just conclude. What we need, therefore, when we come into the people of God, is not more of what they have already. We can be bending over backwards to bring in the latest bit of news and to show that we're aware. Okay, they know that already. What they don't know is perhaps a bit of good formation from what we have in theology, but explained well. But above all, this element of showing but God is for real. If we meet God, they will meet him.